The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long golden streaks across the quiet neighborhood. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of damp earth from a light afternoon drizzle. Most houses had their porch lights flickering on, signaling the approach of evening. But amidst the peaceful setting, a small figure wandered aimlessly down the sidewalk, barefoot, shivering slightly, and clutching a stuffed rabbit to her chest. She couldn't have been older than 6, her tiny face, streaked with dried tears, twisted with confusion as she looked around, trying to make sense of her surroundings. Her pink dress, now wrinkled and slightly muddy, hinted at an earlier fall. She had been walking for what felt like forever, her little legs aching with each step. She didn't know how she got here, nor did she know which way led home. The world suddenly felt much bigger, scarier, and lonelier than ever before. A faint whimpering sound interrupted the girl's quiet sobs. She turned, her teary eyes landing on a dog. A stray by the looks of it. Its fur was a mix of brown and white, though patches of dirt clung to its body. Its ears perked up slightly as it took cautious steps toward her. The girl instinctively stepped back, her tiny fingers tightening around her stuffed rabbit. The dog paused, tilting its head as if studying her. It wasn't big, nor was it particularly threatening. Its eyes, a warm shade of amber, held something unusual, something gentle, almost understanding. It wagged its tail slowly, then took another step closer, sniffing the air between them. The little girl hesitated, but didn't run. She had always liked dogs, but this one was different. It wasn't fluffy or well-groomed like the ones she had seen in her picture books. This one had scratches on its legs, a thin frame that suggested it hadn't eaten well in days, and yet, despite its rough appearance, something about it felt safe. The dog let out another soft whimper and nudged its nose toward her hand. The girl blinked, then, without fully realizing it, reached out hesitantly. The moment her fingers brushed against the dog's fur, a small reassuring warmth spread through her. It was rough, unkempt, but real. She wasn't alone anymore. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, and the dog suddenly turned its head, ears twitching. Then, without warning, it started trotting forward, glancing back as if expecting her to follow. The girl swallowed, glancing in the opposite direction, the one she had come from, but everything looked the same. She had no idea which way led home. The dog barked lightly, its tail wagging with urgency. It wasn't forcing her, just waiting. The girl bit her lip, then took a shaky step forward. The dog's ears perked up, and with that, it continued down the street, leading her somewhere, anywhere. They walked for what felt like a long time, though the girl had stopped counting the steps. The streets looked unfamiliar, yet the dog moved with a sense of purpose, as if it knew exactly where to go. Then, the sky darkened. The warm hues of sunset faded into cooler shades of blue, and streetlights began flickering on, casting soft pools of light along the road. The little girl's stomach rumbled, but she kept going, trusting the quiet companionship of her new guide. Suddenly the dog stopped. Its body tensed, ears pointed forward as it stared down a dimly lit alleyway. A shadow moved. The girl's heart pounded. Was it someone who could help? Or was it something else? The dog let out a low growl, stepping protectively in front of her. The girl clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter, and then, from the darkness, a voice called out, gruff, unfamiliar, and dangerously close. Well, well, what do we have here? The girl froze. The dog's stance stiffened. The alley fell silent, and in that moment, she realized this was not part of the path home. This was something else entirely. The little girl's breath hitched as she tightened her grip on her stuffed rabbit. The voice had come from the shadows, rough and unfamiliar, sending a shiver down her spine. She could barely make out the figure, a tall man, his outline barely visible against the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. He took a slow step forward, and the dog beside her let out a deep, warning growl. Its body tense and ready, the man stopped, seeming to reconsider. "Easy there," he muttered, eyeing the stray dog warily. His tone was different now, less threatening, but still filled with something unsettling. The girl said nothing, her heart pounding so loudly she thought he might hear it. She didn't know this man. She didn't know if he was someone who could help, or if she should turn and run. But before she could decide, the dog took charge. It stepped protectively in front of her, its teeth slightly bared, its stance firm. A moment of silence stretched between them. Then, without warning, the dog let out a sharp bark and lunged forward, not to attack, but just enough to make the man stumble back a step. That was all the little girl needed. Gripping her stuffed rabbit, she turned and ran, her bare feet slapping against the pavement. She didn't look back. She only heard the sound of hurried footsteps, hers, and the rapid, light pattering of the dog beside her. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away. The neighborhood seemed quieter now, eerily so, as if the world had paused, waiting to see what would happen next. The girl's chest heaved as she turned a corner, her breath coming in short gasps. The dog stayed beside her, its presence the only thing keeping her from collapsing in fear. Finally, after what felt like forever, she stopped, her tiny hands pressed against her knees as she struggled to catch her breath. She glanced around. The street was unfamiliar, lined with old houses and fences covered in creeping vines. There was no sign of the man. Had he followed them? The dog sniffed the air, then turned its head as if listening. It seemed satisfied that they were safe for now, because it sat down beside her, panting softly. Tears welled in the girl's eyes. She was lost, completely lost, and she was so tired. She lowered herself to the ground, pulling her knees to her chest. "I want to go home," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The dog whined and nudged her arm with its wet nose, as if to say, "Don't give up." But how could she not? She didn't even know where home was anymore. For a moment, she allowed herself to cry, her tiny frame trembling with exhaustion and fear. The dog curled up beside her, resting its head on her lap. Its warmth was the only comfort she had left. Time passed. She wasn't sure how much. The street remained quiet. The world felt too big, too overwhelming. But then, somewhere in the distance, a faint sound broke through the silence. A voice, calling. At first, she thought she imagined it, but then she heard it again, clearer this time. A woman's voice. The girl's head shot up, her teary eyes widening. "Emma!" Her breath caught in her throat. That was her name. Someone was looking for her. The dog's ears perked up, and it jumped to its feet, tail wagging wildly. The girl scrambled up, her heart racing for an entirely different reason now. She turned toward the voice, scanning the street. "Mommy!" she called, her voice weak but hopeful. And then she saw her, a woman running toward her, her face filled with panic, relief, and so many emotions all at once. Emma didn't think. She dropped her stuffed rabbit and ran, arms outstretched. "Mommy!" Her mother scooped her up, holding her so tightly it almost hurt. "Oh, baby," she sobbed, pressing kisses onto Emma's hair. "I was so scared. I thought I lost you." Emma buried her face in her mother's shoulder, inhaling the familiar scent of home. I got lost, she whispered. I didn't know how to get back. Her mother pulled back just enough to cup her little face. It's okay now, she soothed, brushing away her tears. You're safe. Emma sniffled, then turned to the dog, who stood a few feet away, tail wagging but hesitant, as if unsure of its place now. Emma's mother followed her gaze, her expression softening. Did that dog help you? Emma nodded quickly. He found me. He took me here. Her mother looked at the stray, her eyes filled with something like gratitude. She slowly reached out a hand, but the dog flinched slightly, stepping back. It was as if it wasn't used to kindness. Emma felt her heart squeeze. Wait, she whispered. She wiggled out of her mother's arms and knelt down, holding out her own hand. Come here, she said gently. The dog hesitated, then took a cautious step forward, another step, and then, with a soft sigh, it pressed its head against her palm. Emma smiled through her tears. Her mother watched the scene, then let out a shaky breath. We can't just leave him here, she murmured. He saved you. Emma looked up, hope sparking in her eyes. Can we take him home? Her mother hesitated, glancing at the dog's thin frame, its matted fur, its tired but loyal eyes, and then she made her decision. But just as she was about to say the words, something unexpected happened. A voice, another voice, echoed from down the street. Cooper! Emma and her mother turned. A man stood there, his face shadowed by the streetlights. His eyes were locked on the dog, and the dog, who had been so calm, so steady, suddenly stiffened. Its tail stopped wagging, and for the first time, Emma saw something different in its eyes. Recognition and fear. Her mother's grip on her shoulder. I tightened. The man took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the dog. Emma swallowed. Something was wrong. The dog, Cooper, had led her home, but now it looked like it was the one who wanted to run. Emma felt her mother's hand tighten on her shoulder as the man took another step forward. The street was silent, except for the hum of distant traffic and the faint rustling of leaves in the cold evening breeze. The dog, Cooper, stood frozen, his body tense, his eyes locked on the man. His tail, which had once wagged so freely, now tucked low between his legs. Emma had never seen him like this before. The man exhaled sharply. I can't believe it, he muttered, shaking his head. It's really you. Cooper let out a soft whimper, his ears pressed flat against his head. Emma looked up at her mother, searching for an answer in her face, but she looked just as confused. Who is he? Emma whispered. Her mother hesitated, then stepped protectively in front of her. Sir, do you know this dog? She asked cautiously. The man nodded slowly, his face filled with something unreadable. Yeah, he murmured. I do. He crouched down, his voice gentle now. Hey, buddy. You remember me? Cooper let out a low, uncertain whine, his paws shifting against the pavement. Emma's heart clenched. Something about this moment didn't feel right. The man swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. I lost him over a year ago, he said, still watching the dog closely. He was my best friend, until he disappeared. He looked up at Emma's mother, his eyes glistening. I searched everywhere. I put up flyers, checked every shelter I could, but he was just gone. Emma's mother's expression softened. So, you're saying this is your dog? The man nodded. His name is Cooper. I raised him since he was a puppy. His voice cracked slightly. I thought he was gone forever. Emma felt her chest tighten. She looked at Cooper, at the way his body stayed stiff, at the way he kept his distance. If this man had been looking for him for so long, Why didn't Cooper run to him? Why wasn't he happy? Emma knelt beside him, placing a small hand on his fur. Is that true? She whispered. Cooper didn't move. He only stared at the man, his body trembling slightly. Something wasn't right. Emma's mother seemed to sense it too. If he was yours, why did he run away? She asked carefully. The man blinked, caught off guard. I don't know, he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. One day he was just gone. I figured someone took him or... He exhaled, sharply, shaking his head. I don't know what happened, but I loved him. I would never hurt him. Emma glanced at Cooper again. His breathing was heavy, his paws digging slightly into the pavement, as if he was caught between fight or flight. She didn't know everything about dogs, but she knew one thing. Cooper had led her home. He had protected her. He had stayed by her side when she was scared. And now he didn't seem to trust this man. Emma's mother seemed to struggle with what to do. Look, I understand how much you must have missed him, she said, choosing her words carefully. But I don't think he wants to go with you. The man's face fell. I just want to take him home, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma suddenly felt a lump in her throat. She looked at Cooper again, then at the man. If Cooper had a home before, did that mean she couldn't keep him? She sniffled and reached out, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck. I don't want him to go, she said softly. Cooper pressed, his nose against her cheek, his tail giving the smallest wag. The man sighed heavily, rubbing his hands over his face. He looked tired, like someone who had spent a long time looking for something, only to realize it might not want to be found. After a long silence, he nodded. If he wants to stay with you, I won't take him away, he said finally. Emma's heart leapt. Really? The man let out a soft, sad chuckle. Yeah, he swallowed hard, looking at Cooper one last time. Maybe he found where he belongs now. Emma's mother gave him a small, understanding smile. That's very kind of you. The man nodded again, then took a step back. Take good care of him, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He's special. Emma nodded fiercely. I promise. Cooper watched as the man turned and walked away, his footsteps slow and heavy. Emma wasn't sure if Cooper understood what had just happened. But as soon as the man disappeared down the street, the dog let out a long breath and nudged his nose against Emma's hand. Her mother knelt beside them, running a gentle hand through Cooper's fur. I guess we have a new family member now, she said with a warm smile. Emma beamed. We do. Cooper let out a happy bark, his tail wagging, and freely once more, and for the first time that night, Emma felt like everything was exactly the way it was meant to be.